The message of Zechariah. This is the second presentation in the series, and in this presentation I'm going to look at chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Zechariah, and I've entitled this Restored Mission. The message of Zechariah, Restored Mission. Before we look at chapters 2 and 3, let's go back and look at chapter 1 for a moment. We saw there that Zechariah was a prophet, but he received his understandings from God through visions, pictures, events, situations. And these visions revealed insights that had been given to him from God. This is the way prophecy works. God gives insights directly to individuals, and they relate to specific situations in specific contexts, and very often to specific people. The people here was a struggling group of returning exiles. They'd come back from Babylon. They'd resettled in Jerusalem and the area round about, and life was pretty tough. And Zechariah was bringing them insights from God about their situation. This group needed reassurance, and they needed an understanding of what was going on. Their ancestors had been taken away in captivity into Babylon, and they are the descendants returning. Why had God allowed this to happen? Why had God allowed the city of Jerusalem to be sacked? Why had the temple been destroyed? Did God have any future purpose for them? There were many questions in their mind, and life was tough. But they needed to rethink a way forward for the future. The people just before the exile had not lived well. The rich had got richer, the poor had got poorer. There was terrific exploitation, deception, and wrong things were happening. And in a sense, the collapse of the Judean society was almost inevitable. Now, what was the way forward? What did God want from them? What was the plan? Overall, this group of people needed reassurance that Judah, the people of God, were still God's people. After all, they'd spent these years in exile. Reassurance that a restoration was possible, was happening, could happen, could continue. They had suffered 70 years of misery, they and their ancestors. Would prosperity ever come again? Would they be secure in their land, fulfilling the purposes of God? Indeed, did God still have a purpose for them? Now, with that in mind, let's look at Zechariah chapter 2. Another vision. Then I looked, and there was before me a man with a measuring line in his hand. I asked, "Where are you going?" He answered me, "To measure Jerusalem, to find out how wide and how long it is." Now, the measuring line always has a standard meaning. It's simply a metaphor. And the very fact that Jerusalem was going to be measured meant that Jerusalem would be rebuilt. It was worth measuring. So that's what it's saying. An encouragement to them that the city which was in ruins, it was going to be rebuilt. Now let's look at the map for a moment or two. There's the area which is the traditional area of Israel. You can see the Lake of Galilee to the north, flowing into the Jordan River and flowing eventually into the Dead Sea in the south. Judah was a very small part of that. Most of the land had been destroyed, the people had been taken away by the Assyrians, and they did not return. The people in Judah had survived a bit longer, eventually into exile in Babylon. Now they were beginning to trickle back. The land was tiny. Just look at the dimensions at the bottom. Insignificant and small. Was it a purpose in God's plan for this group of struggling people? The vision goes on. While the angel who was speaking to me was leaving, another angel came to meet him and said to him, "Run, tell that young man, Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of people and animals in it. And I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within." What a magnificent picture. Jerusalem stands for the worshipping people of God, the worship center of God's people. And here there would be a city without walls. It's a picture of this tiny struggling group rattling in a city that had been wrecked and ransacked and destroyed. And the city would be rebuilt, yes, but it would be bursting with people who were seeking to worship God. And God would protect them. Indeed, God would be the very glory of that people, because he would be there within it, within his people. What a glorious picture. And in the great Passover days, in the days of Jesus, the city of Jerusalem drew in large numbers from all around who travelled to celebrate the Passover. And in part, it was fulfilled. The city was bursting at the seams, and every bit of accommodation for miles around was taken. But it speaks of something even bigger. The people of God will keep on growing in number, spilling out, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that has been the history of the world. The followers of Jesus keep on growing in number. And it kept on growing, and is still growing today. Perhaps in the West we see a decline, but in most parts of the world it's growth. A city without walls, because of the great number of people there to worship the God, the creator of the universe. What a wonderful, glorious picture. That gave the people hope. There were just handfuls of them. They were struggling just to survive. But here's a picture of what could and would happen. The vision goes on. Come, come, flee from the land of the north, declares the Lord, for I have scattered you to the four winds of heaven, declares the Lord. And here's an invitation for the people to return from exile, because only a small number had come back to this point. Come on back. Come back to your homeland. Rebuild, restart. That's the message, the invitation of God. Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, for I am coming, and I will live among you, declares the Lord. Many nations will be joined with the Lord on that day and will become my people. I will live among you, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. The Lord will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem. Be still before the Lord, all mankind, because he has roused himself from his holy dwelling. A picture of growth and life. Judah is the symbolism of God's people. God is taking his people back. He's centering it all in the worship, symbolism of Jerusalem, God's worship. And many nations will be joined with the Lord on that day. Growth, outreach, moving out beyond. God would live among them. They would be his people. But the interesting thing is many nations. This wasn't something for some special little chosen small group and a fragment of the population of the world. This was big. This is big. And you can see it fulfilled today as nations are coming and growth is there. And it has gone on over the centuries. Yes, there's a message of hope, says Zechariah. A message that encouraged the people to return from exile. A message that God was still in action. He hadn't written off his people. He was going to protect them, look after them, be present with them. He was going to look after them and protect his people. What a message of encouragement. And he would be there with his people. And his people would include those who were the people of Judah, but it would expand away beyond to all other nations. And there would be a reverence before God as people realized what God was doing. God is at work. Oh, we need these messages of encouragement today, particularly in the West when things are against us. Yes, like the people of Judah, we need to put our house in order. There is much that's wrong amongst the people of God. But God is still there on our side. And there's still a plan and a purpose and a progress. And he will be with us and move us forward. We'll return to that again in a moment. The picture given to these people was of security, protection, God's provision, and expansion. That's the messages they needed to hear. They were discouraged. They were fighting against the odds. The opposition was considerable. The place had fallen apart. They were small in number. They were insignificant. They were still under the authority of the great Persian Empire. They needed all of that. Too often today we've thought of God's people as our little closed group, and we've built our membership systems as closed memberships. We've said to people, believe A, believe B, believe C, sign here, you're in. And other groups down the street in other towns, because they don't quite conform to that pattern, they're not in. This is not the way of the Bible. And history reveals that there was a kind of mixed up nature of Judaism in the days of Jesus. That throughout the Roman Empire there had grown up groups of people known as God-fearers. They had been impressed by the simplicity and the integrity of the Jewish faith. They were not Jews. They didn't conform to Jewish practices. But they were seeking to live their lives worshipping the God who made the universe. And it was a revulsion against the multiple polytheism of the Roman Empire. And Paul moved amongst these people and showed them that what they desired was fulfilled in Jesus. We need to be flexible in our boundaries, to welcome people in. We need to be tolerant and open. God is on the march. God is moving. God is reaching out in all sorts of ways to touch lives, to bless lives, and to make our lives more rich and more full. God's people is a big concept, and we've often lost a bit of it today. Now let's look at chapter 3, and we come to vision 4. In the first 3 visions, what Zechariah is saying is, I still care for you. I'm ready to restore you, and I've still got a task for you to reach out this restored mission for God's people. And these messages are still there for us today, even when we're seeming to decline in the West. He's still on our side. He's ready to restore us if only we will respond. And he's still got a task for us. Now vision 4. This addresses the area of leadership. Oh, how critical leadership is amongst God's people. Before the exile, the Jewish people had leaders that were kings or priests. These were the 2 leadership structures of the society of the day. Kings were descended from David onwards from the tribe of Judah. Priests all came from the tribe of Levi, and there was no crossover. Kings and priests were kept separate. The tragedy was that before the exile, both of these groups had very often become self-serving, corrupt, and even deluded. They worked together, and those in powerful positions in the legal system could be bribed easily by either group. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. Self-serving, feathering their own nest, making life good for them at the expense of the majority. That was the common pattern, and you see it clearly in the prophecies of Isaiah and Micah, written about the same time. The utter corruption of the society of the day. In the days of Jeremiah, just before the exile, Jeremiah warned them that if they didn't put their house in order, Jerusalem would be captured and sacked, the temple would be destroyed. And the leadership just laughed at him. Oh no, we're God's people. God won't allow that to happen. They were deluded. They were wrong. Jeremiah was right. And in the West, we're in great danger of thinking that somehow God's going to see us through these difficult days. He's calling us now with bluntness. Put your house in order, or the whole thing will implode or explode or fall apart. That's the picture before the exile, where leadership had gone adrift. What was it to be for the future? There's the vision. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right side to accuse him. The Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this man a burning stick snatched from the fire?" Now Joshua was dressed in filthy clothes as he stood before the angel. The angel said to those who were standing before him, "Take off his filthy clothes." And he said to Joshua, "See, I have taken away your sin, and I will put fine garments on you." Then I said, "Put a clean turban on his head." So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him, while the angel of the Lord stood by. Joshua happened to be the high priest who had come back from exile, and he was serving as high priest at that time. All they had, as far as we can see, was just an altar that had been rebuilt in the temple precinct. But Joshua was functioning as the high priest amongst the small group of people who'd returned. But there's a kind of symbolism here. Joshua, the high priest, made the sacrifice on behalf of the people. This man represented the people before God. And here in the vision, Zechariah sees Joshua standing before God and Satan pointing the finger at him. You've messed up. And in a sense he's saying to all the people of God who'd returned, you've messed up, you deserve nothing, you've no hope, you've no future. And God turns on Satan. The Lord rebuke you. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem, that's my worship center, rebuke you. Is not this a man a burning stick snatched from the fire? You see, Zechariah was being shown an insight into the spiritual realm. What was going on behind the scenes that you can't see? Satan was trying to pull down the people, accuse them. They'd failed. But God was on the side of the people. God's people had been rescued from exile. They hadn't been burnt out and wiped out completely. A group had been restored and returned, and further groups would join them. God had intervened and rescued. They'd been rescued from complete destruction. God's people had failed totally. And again, Joshua representing God's people. The filth, all the things they'd done wrong, God was going to deal with that. Take off his filthy clothes. A new start was coming. God's people were to be forgiven and recommissioned. God's leader was to be forgiven and recommissioned. Fine garments. They hadn't earned it. They didn't deserve it. God was going to do it. Here was restored mission. Satan could say what he liked. And indeed the people in the past, their ancestors, had failed miserably. But God was dealing with the issue by his grace and his goodness. And he was giving a fresh start and a new beginning. Fine garments, a new turban. Clean turban on his head and clothed him, equipping the leader and the people for the mission that lay ahead. You can look at it at two levels. God's leaders were to be forgiven and recommissioned, symbolized by Joshua the high priest. But Joshua represented the people. God's people were to be forgiven and recommissioned. God still had a task for them. There was restored mission. There was a purpose. There was a destiny for God's people. But as so often, there are conditions. Again and again, we're at risk of taking great promises in the Bible, ripping them out of context, making them our own, without looking at the fine print. What are God's conditions? The angel of the Lord gave this charge to Joshua. This is what the Lord Almighty says. If you will walk in obedience to me and keep my requirements, then You will govern my house and have charge of my courts, and I will give you a place among those standing here. There are conditions. And the condition is this: Joshua representing the people, but Joshua as a leader. He's been given fresh clothes. The past was being forgiven. It was being dealt with. He was being given a fresh start. There was a great future lying ahead, if you'll do it my way. God's ways are not onerous. God's ways are not there as petty rules to keep us in our place. God is not a kind of divine policeman. God gives us these guidance and these directions because that's the best way for us. That's the way success comes. That's the way things work best. That's the way God can bless us most. That's the way we can bless others most. It's all positive. But if we decide to do it our way, and we ignore the way of God, then we forfeit the blessings so often. And that is the tragedy of God's people throughout the ages. It's what happened before the exile. The consequences were almost inevitable. And indeed, it's what's happening in the West today. We are in a measure ignoring God's conditions. We need to put our house in order, particularly in leadership, but also in the general sense of God's people. We've got to go back and say, what does God want? We're running religious systems, and Jesus never came to set up a religious system. We need to be fresh garments, fresh clothes, recommissioning to restored mission, and then look again at God's way of doing things and following it in obedience. There are conditions. God knows what's best for us. We don't. No matter how clever or able we are, God knows what's best. And He knows what's best for leadership. Leadership needs refreshed and renewed. And this is a great message of this passage. God will direct, if only we will follow. If only we will follow. If only we will do it His way. So often we forfeit the blessing by not doing it His way. It all comes back to that. If only. And as a call here to God's people, particularly in the West, let's look again at what God wants. Let's look again at our religious systems. Let's do a bit of revolutionary thinking. Let's seek Him again with an open book and an open mind. God knows what's best. And leaders have an enormous responsibility to take us forward. Now God's going to deal with the problem of human rebellion and failure, taking off the filthy clothes and putting on new ones. Listen, says God, High Priest Joshua, you and your associates are seated before you, who are men symbolic of things to come. I am going to bring my servant the branch. See the stone I have set in front of Joshua? There are 7 eyes in that one stone, and I will engrave an inscription on it, says the Lord Almighty, and I will remove the sin of this land in a single day. In that day each of you will invite your neighbor to sit under the vine and fig tree, declares the Lord. A remarkable picture. The hint is there at the beginning. This is for the future. Listen, you men are symbolic of things to come. Zechariah was beginning to grasp something of what God was going to do to fundamentally deal with human rebellion and failure once and for all. And the picture here is someone who's coming as a servant. The word branch just means someone sprouting out of a line. Removing the sin of this land in a single day. The word for sin there is the word that carries with it the meaning of consciously deviating from what is God's way. deliberately deciding to do it our way, not God's way. And that pictures what had been happening with the people before the exile, particularly the leadership. The 7 eyes is a number of perfection. God's going to do this. And it's going to lead to complete security. Here is a picture of something that is coming when God addresses the fundamental problem of humanity. Let's focus on that phrase. Going to bring my servant, the branch. Zechariah has not introduced a new idea. It occurred in previous prophetic sayings. Let's look at a few of them. Now, way back in the 8th century BC, Isaiah had said that a shoot will come from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. Jesse was the father of David, the great king. So it's coming from the Davidic line. The picture is of a tree that's been kind of sawn off, leaving a stump in the ground. But the tree is not really dead, the roots are there. And it can still produce new sprouting shoots coming from this stump. And the picture is of a branch coming up, a branch that is able to bear fruit. Jeremiah, speaking just before the exile, said that. The days are coming when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. Here again, coming from the line of David, righteous, going God's way, a king, reigning wisely, doing what is just and right in the land. That was the exact opposite of what was happening in the days of Jeremiah, where the rulers were lining their own pockets at the expense of the poor. There was no integrity at all. And Jeremiah goes on, in those days and at that time, I will make a righteous branch sprout from David's line. He will do what is just and right in the land, confirming the same kind of picture. These great men of God who had insights from God were seeing something that was going to happen during the exile. Ezekiel, the prophet who was with the exiles in Babylon, he saw this and said this, I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. David was long gone, but he saw someone from the line of David coming as being a prince. And he goes on later to say, my servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. They will follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees. He saw this new king being like a shepherd, looking after his people. All the people of the world, they all will have one shepherd, and they will be enabled to do it God's way and to serve him. Against that background, Zechariah takes it a bit further, because this is now in the late 6th century. Tell him this is what the Lord Almighty says, here is the man whose name is the branch. He will branch out from his place and build the temple of the Lord. It is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he'll be clothed with majesty, and will sit and rule on his throne, and he will be a priest on his throne. And there will be harmony between the two. This takes it a lot further. The people there were struggling to face up to rebuilding the temple. And the idea of being clothed with majesty, or a ruler being in that position. But somebody who was a ruler, a king, and a priest, so that the lines of being a priest and being a king would be together in harmony. There is a deep and new thought here which Zechariah was grasping. A king and a priest. One of the great principles was that these two lines were kept so separate. Now they were being brought together in God's plan. Someone was going to come in the future. That's the kind of description we've got. A descendant of David. a servant, and righteous. Interesting picture. He would fulfill the role of a high priest, but he would also fulfill the role of a king. Both in one. Remarkable. And he would remove the rebellion from the entire people in a day. And as Zechariah was seeing pictures of this, gaining wonderful insights, building on the insights of the previous prophets, with hindsight we can see how wonderfully Jesus fulfilled that pattern. Jesus was descended from the line of David. He served. He lived the most perfect, righteous life. And the book to the Hebrews shows how he fulfilled the role of a high priest, taking a sacrifice into the Holy of Holies once and for all. But the sacrifice was his own life, which he gave willingly and by choice, by going to death by torture on a cross. And he was restored, resurrected, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And by that event at the cross, he removed the rebellion from the entire people in a day. It is all made available to humanity if we'll just accept it. He did it. He dealt with the human problem and dilemma. And as a result, he generates peace and security. No longer do we have to struggle to try and impress God by self-effort, never knowing if we succeeded. That's the way of religion. It doesn't work. Because of what Jesus has done, he releases peace and security so that we're equipped to live for God by the power of the Spirit. It's a transforming new leadership that was coming. It was different because it was going to transform the led, bringing security, protection, expansion, provision. We can see all this having happened today. This is God's wonderful plan that Zechariah was beginning to grasp. Someone who'd be both a king and a priest. The king described with these sort of words and language. Perfect. And a priest on a throne. Building a temple of the Lord, that's you and me, God's people, because he's removed the rebellion of the people in a day. What a beautiful picture, worked out so fully in the New Testament and explained theologically in the book to the Hebrews. A transforming new leadership so that God's people would have restored mission. And the people would have one shepherd. One shepherd for all God's people throughout the world. And because God has dealt with the problem of human rebellion, we are equipped and enabled to live God's way and to do what he wants us to do and live life to the full and rich and expand and reach out to others. A transforming new leadership to release restored mission. The beautiful picture that Zechariah was bringing to these people all these centuries ago. In the next presentation, we're going to move forward and look at God's power to enable all this to happen.